This one is about religion and social change. So there are 4 things we're going to go through today. The first one is we're going to look at the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King. We're also going to look at the new Christian right in America, which hasn't been successful in creating the social change they want. So we're going to contrast those 2 examples. Then we're going to look at Marxism. We're then going to look at liberation theology, which is a set of Christian ideas which led to some radical social change in Latin America. And then finally, we're going to finish with the evaluations. So if you stick around to the end, you're definitely going to have enough examples, theories, concepts to answer this question. We're starting off with the civil rights movement in America. So brief history lesson, let's just recap some of the dates relating to the civil rights movement and the history that led up to that. Slavery begins, Africans are taken from Africa and forced into slavery in America. This continues to 1865 when slavery was abolished after the Civil War. Slavery was abolished in America, but what happened in the southern states was a period of segregation began. So black and white people were segregated in the services they could use, the buses they could travel on, the schools they could go to, the water fountains. So from 1954 you have the civil rights movement beginning, led by Martin Luther King, and then in 1964 the government banned segregation. So the civil rights movement was a success. So our key thinker here is Bruce. Bruce argues that religion was an ideological resource which led to the civil rights movement being successful. What he means by an ideological resource is it provided the ideas, the motivation, the teachings that supported the people campaigning in the civil rights movement. So Christian teachings inspired, motivated, and supported the people who were campaigning. There are 3 ways in which he said it did this. Now the first way was black church leaders from the southern states could use Christian teachings to challenge white church leaders and wider society if they supported segregation, because they could say in the Bible Jesus said love thy neighbour as thyself, and there are many teachings about treating people equally. The teachings themselves could be used by the priests in the southern states to shame and force people who supported segregation, and particularly priests who weren't campaigning against it, to join their side and, to change their minds. The second way in which it did this was by mobilizing public opinion across America. Remember, it was the southern states of America where segregation was still taking place. And what the church did was use their influence, use their organization to spread the message across the whole of America. So it changed people's attitudes, it changed people's minds, and it made sure that public opinion was in favor of banning segregation in the southern states. The third way in which it did this was by acting as a neutral party in disputes. Because white Americans and people who supported segregation respected the church, if the church organised a talk or a discussion, people were happy to engage with it because the church was seen as above politics. Bruce contrasts the success of the civil rights movement with the failure of the new Christian right to achieve their reforms. They believe the Bible is the literal truth of God. They believe that the only acceptable relationship is a heterosexual relationship between married couples. They want to take America back to God. That's their idea. They believe America has moved away from God by allowing sex outside marriage, the tolerance or promotion of same-sex relationships. They also have huge financial resources. They're very wealthy, and they have strong links to the Republican Party, which is Donald Trump's party. Despite these huge financial resources, a big presence in the media, and these political allies, they haven't achieved their aims. Bruce argues the reason the new Christian right haven't been successful is because they're going against the opinions of society. Surveys show that most Americans have liberal values. Liberal means, well, liberty is another word for freedom. Americans want freedom. They want to be able to pick who to have a relationship with, sex outside marriage, all of these sorts of things. They don't want strict ideas, and particularly they don't want strict ideas from, religious thinking governing their lives. So the new Christian right has been unsuccessful because they're trying to push against public opinion, whereas the civil rights protest was a success because they were going with the public opinion. The second theory you can use to back up the view that religion is a force for social change, that it can inspire social change, is Marxism. Now you're probably thinking that doesn't make sense because I've learned that Marxism is a way of limiting social change and controlling the proletariat. And you're correct. Marxism does argue that religion is controlled by the ruling class in society. The ruling class are the bourgeoisie, the business owners, and the ideas taught by religion are what's known as ruling class ideology. The ideas will be the ideas which benefit the ruling class. So they justify exploitation, they justify capitalism, and they don't do anything which would make the workers think about rebelling against their situation. Remember, it creates false consciousness. It disguises, religion disguises the true experience of exploitation at work. So for more information on this, watch the video on Marxism. I'll put a link in the description below. But what Marx himself recognised, and his colleagues, was that religion has a dual character. There are two sides to religion. The key thinker here is Engels. Now, he was someone who actually wrote with Marx. He was one of Marx's colleagues. And Engels argues religion does have this dual character. It does what we've said, legitimise and justify class inequality. It serves the needs of the ruling class. But secondly, it also can inspire hope. It can make people believe that a better world is possible, and that can lead to social change. And the reason it does this is the most senior members of the church may limit social change because they may even come from a bourgeoisie background themselves. But junior members of the church can be more radical, and we see examples of this, and we'll look at an example of this later, where the junior members of the church can side with the workers or exploited groups. A neo-Marxist thinker who agrees with this is Ernest Bloch. Neo-Marxism just means more recent thinkers who have adapted Marxist thinking, and Bloch says religion has a dual character too, and the particular word he uses to describe the way in which religion can lead to social change is that it provides utopian views. A utopia is a perfect world, and what he's saying is religion can inspire us because it shows us that utopian world, heaven on earth, could be achieved, and therefore religion has a dual character. So Marxism, on the one hand, does accept that religion justifies and legitimates class inequality and therefore blocks social change, but it also has a dual character where it can inspire people to aim for a utopian world, and it can inspire social change. So the third theory or piece of evidence we're going to look at, which shows that religion can be a force for social change, is liberation theology, which emerged in Latin America in the 1960s. At this time in Latin America, a number of countries were ruled by military dictatorships. They weren't democracies, people didn't vote for the governments. They were military dictatorships who maintained their rule through torture, through killing opposition, and through force. So the majority of the people were extremely poor, and there was a small elite who were very rich, who kept their power through force and the threats of violence. For decades leading up to the 60s, the church took a very conservative view about this. So they didn't tell the peasants that they should rebel or they should organise. They kind of told them to accept their fate. You know, this was just how things were. They didn't take a view which radically opposed these military dictatorships. In the 1960s, liberation theology starts to emerge. Now, liberation theology refers to a set of Christian ideas and teachings which encourage the priests to take the side of the peasants. And what this led to was priests running education programs for the peasants, teaching them about the unfairness in society, teaching them to read and write so they could challenge what the government was doing. And at the time, they were some of the only people in society, or they were the only authorities in society who criticised the military dictatorship. And it was the Christian teachings of liberation theology which radicalised the peasants, and it radicalised the rest of the Catholic Church. During this period from the 1960s to the 1980s, there were significant improvements in human rights and the protection of human rights in Latin America. So liberation theology was a success. It led to social change. Two theorists you can use to back up the view that liberation theology was a force for social change. Casanova argued that religion was essential in bringing about social change, that liberation theology was the key ingredient which led to social change in Latin America. So Casanova supports the view that liberation theology was essential in bringing about that social change. The second theorist you can use is Maduro. He's a neo-Marxist, and he says liberation theology shows that religion does not always serve the needs of the ruling class. That in fact, in this case, liberation theology, the teachings of the church, it radicalised the peasants, it radicalised the wider church, and this led to revolutionary change. If you get a question in the exam and it says, evaluate the view, religion is a force for social change, we can use all of the examples we've talked about, the civil rights movement, liberation theology, and say, yes, religion is a force for social change. But to evaluate, we may say, how significant was that change? The civil rights movement ended segregation, but of course African Americans are still discriminated against in America. How radical was the change? And the same with liberation theology. Big improvements in human rights, but there are still the majority of people in Latin America, the poor, are living very hard lives economically. Remember, Bruce says religion is mainly a force for social change when it's going in the direction society or the government are going in anyway. So I would use that to evaluate my answers and say, yes, it can be a force for social change, but they may not be the biggest social changes for the people, for the groups involved. Now, to finish this off and make sure you've got all the information you need to get a top mark, you need to watch the video, Evidence Religion is a Conservative Social Force, and Weber's view on religions. You'll need that information to get that top grade. I'll put the links in the description below, and there's some links at the end of the video. Well done for listening. Take care.